Okay, so this is our matrix that we're going to try to work with here. And let's remember what we want this matrix to look like. In our notes from last time, we wrote that we want our matrix to look like this. We need ones in these spots, zeros in these spots, and then we don't really care what's over here. It can be any number. That's why there's just an A and a B there. It could be anything. It doesn't matter. So our goal is to get this matrix to look like this one. And we're going to work on the first row first, moving from left to right. So if we start in the first row, moving from left to right, we have a 1. And our goal is to have a 1 there. So we don't have to do anything to that. Our next number is a -2, where we should have a 0. So we need to change this -2 so that it becomes a 0. So when you have to change a number to become a 0, you're going to have to use another row to help you do it. So if you look at the second row, we have a 1 just below the -2. So if we were to multiply this row by +2, that would give us a +2 here, that when we add it to this row, it would make a 0. So it's the same as like when we were eliminating a variable and we were solving by elimination. We would multiply one of the equations by something in order to make a variable cancel out. It's similar to what we're doing here. So we're going to take 2 times row 2, 2 times row 2, and then we're going to add that to row 1. In order to get this -2 to become a 0. So we're going to use this as sort of a formula to figure out each new number of our first row. So the first number of our new first row, we're going to follow this formula, 2 times row 2, which in the first spot has a 3. So 2 times row 2, and in row 2 we have a 3, plus row 1, which that number is a 1. Okay, second spot, follow this formula, 2 times row 2, which row 2 in the second spot is a 1, plus row 1, which is -2. Draw the bar, that means equals. Okay, and then the last one, we have 2 times row 2, which would be a 13, plus row 1, which is 9. So those are going to be our new numbers for the first row. Right now, the second row does not change. So even though we're using the second row to help us change the first row, we're not actually changing the second row right now. So it's going to stay 3, 1, 13. Okay, so the next step is just to do that math from those formulas that we just wrote. 2 times 3 is 6, plus 1 is 7. 2 times 1 is 2, plus -2 is 0, which is what we wanted to happen. That's why we did that work. And 2 times 13 is 26, plus 9 is 35. And the second row didn't change, 3, 1, 13. Okay, so we got this number to become a 0, but as we were doing that, we changed our first number. It used to be a 1, which is what we needed it to be, but now it's a 7. So before we can move to the second row, we have to finish fixing the first row. So we have to fix this so that it becomes a 1 again. When you need a number to change to a 1, you don't have to do a huge formula like this. All you have to do is multiply that first row by whatever is going to make this become a 1. So if you think about 7 divided by 7 is 1, and that's the same thing as 1/7 times 7. So really, if you need a number to become a 1, all you have to do is multiply it by a fraction where that number is in the denominator. 1/7 times row 1. So when we do 1/7 times row 1, 7 times 1/7 is 1, which is what we wanted. 0 times 1/7 is still 0. And 35 times 1/7 is the same as 35 divided by 7, which is 5. And the second row didn't change. 3, 1, 13. So now the first row is finished. We have a 1 where we need it. We have a 0 where we need it. We don't care that this is a 5. It could be anything. So now we can start working on the second row. So the first number in a second row, right now it's a 3, but we need it to be a 0. So when you need a number to become a 0, you use the other row to help you do it, just like we did in this first step. So if I multiply this first row by -3, that would give me a -3 in this spot. That would then add to this +3 to become 0. So we're doing -3 times row 1, and then we're going to add that to row 2. Okay, I'm going to move down here just so I can have some more room. So right now the first row is not changing. Even though we're using it to help us change the second row, the first row is going to stay the same. So if you want to go ahead and write that, you can. Just make sure that you space it out because our matrix is going to look like this one for this step. So we have 1, 0, 5. Then we use this formula to help us change the second row. So -3 times row 1, which in the first spot is 1, plus row 2, which was 3. In the second spot, -3 times row 1, which is 0, plus row 2, which was 1. Third spot, -3 times row 1, which was 5, plus row 2, which is 13. Okay, so now we just need to do that math in the second row. The first row is going to stay the same. -3 times 1 is -3, plus 3 is 0, which is what we were trying to get to happen. -3 times 0 is still 0, plus 1 is 1. -3 times 5 is -15, plus 13 is -2. Okay, now we have our matrix looking like what we needed it to look like. We have ones in the right spots, we have zeros in the right spots, and then we don't really care what these numbers are out here. So once you get your matrix to look like this, we can change back into equations. So each row is going to be our new equations. So the first row, this first number is our x coefficient. So we just have one x, which means we can just write x. We don't have to write 1. Then 0 means that we don't have a y term. It's 0y, which would be 0. So that means we don't have a y. That bar stands for equals. Then we have a 5. So that equation becomes x equals 5. The second row, we have 0x, which means we don't have an x term. 1y, so it's just y, equals -2. So we have our solution now, x equals 5 and y equals -2. So if we write that as an ordered pair, we get 5, -2. That's our solution. Okay, we're going to look at one more example. Okay, this is example 3. Our system of equations is x plus y equals 7 and x plus 2y equals 11. All right, let's create our matrix from these equations. The first equation, we have 1x, 1y equals 7. Second equation, we have 1x, 2y equals 11. Okay, so we need to change this matrix to look like our goal, which is in the first row, we need a 1 and a 0. In the second row, we need a 0 and a 1. So we'll start with the first row. The first number is already a 1. That's what we need it to be. But we need the second number to be a 0. And we have to use the other row to help us do that. So we need to figure out what we need to multiply this second row by so that we have a -1 here that would then add with this +1 to become 0. So we need to turn this 2 into a -1 by multiplying by something. So first of all, just to get from a positive to a negative, we'll have to multiply by something that's negative. And then to get from 2 to 1 by multiplying by a number, we would have to multiply by 1/2. So we'll multiply by -1/2. So -1/2 times row 2, and then add it to row 1. That's what we're going to do. Okay, so we're using this as a formula to change the first row. So the first number, -1/2, times row 2, which is 1, plus row 1, which is 1. Second number, -1/2 times row 2, which was 2, plus row 1, which was 1. Last number, -1/2 times row 2, which is 11, plus row 1, which was 7. And for now, the second row is not changing. 1, 2, 11. Okay, let's do that little bit of math from the first row. -1/2 times 1 is -1/2, plus 1 is +1/2. Okay, -1/2 times 2 is -1, plus 1 is 0, which is what we wanted to happen. So if we didn't get a 0 there, we did something wrong. Okay, this last one, you could easily do this in your calculator if you wanted to, but you don't have to. -1/2 times 11 is -11/2, plus 7, which you can write 7 as 14/2. So -11 plus 14 is +3. We end up with 3/2. And the second row didn't change. 1, 2, 11. Okay. So working on the first row still, because in changing this number to a 0, we also changed our first number from a 1 to a 1/2. So we need this 1/2 to be a 1 again. So to change a number to a 1, we have to multiply that row by something. So to get 1/2 to become a 1, we would need to multiply by 2. So we're doing 2 times row 1. Okay, so 1/2 times 2 is 1. 0 times 2 is still 0. 3/2 times 2 is 6/2, which is 3. And the second row didn't change. 1, 2, 11. Okay, our first row is finished. We have a 1 and a 0 where we need it. So we can start working on the second row. The first number in the second row is a 1 where we need it to be a 0. So when you need a number to become a 0, you use the other row to help you do it. So I would need this first row to become a -1 right here, so that when I add it to this +1, it would become 0. So the way I get this first row to have a -1 here is by multiplying by -1. So we're doing -1 times row 1, and then we're going to add it to row 2. And I'm going to do that down here where I have space. I'm going to space out my first row because it's not changing, but I know my second row is going to be a little bit bigger this time since we're doing some math. So first row didn't change, 1, 0, and 3. Now we use this formula to help us change the second row. So -1 times row 1, which in the first spot is 1, plus row 2, which was 1. Second spot, we have -1 times row 1, which is 0, plus row 2, which is 2. Third spot, -1 times row 1, which is 3, plus row 2, which was 11. Okay, do this little bit of math. First of all, the first row is not changing. 1, 0, 3. Second row, we have -1 times 1, which is -1, plus 1 is 0, which is what we wanted to happen. -1 times 0 is still 0, plus 2 is 2. -1 times 3 is -3, plus 11 is 8. Okay, so we changed this first number in the second row to a 0. Now we can move on to the next number. In the other example that we worked, this happened to already be a 1, so we were finished. But now it's not, it's a 2, so we need to change it to a 1. To change a number to a 1, you multiply that row by something, by whatever it's going to take to make this number become a 1. So to get 2 to become a 1 by multiplying, we need to multiply by 1/2. So we're going to do 1/2 times row 2. This is our next step, 1/2 times row 2, which means row 1 is not changing. It's 1, 0, 3. But we're doing 1/2 times row 2. So 0 times 1/2 is still 0. 2 times 1/2 is 1, which is what we wanted. And 8 times 1/2 is 4. Now we have our matrix looking like we need it to. We have 1s where we need them. We have 0s where we need them. So we can change these rows back into equations. So the first row, we have 1x. We don't have a y term. And then we have equals 3. The second row, we don't have an x term, but we have a y equals 4. So that means our solution is 3, 4. Okay, so just know when you are working your practice problems and you create your matrix, you start with the first row and you go from left to right. So in both of the examples that we worked, our first number in our first row just happened to already be a 1. So we didn't have to do any work to change it to become a 1. If you work a problem where it's not already a 1, that's where you need to start, is by changing that whatever number it is into a 1. And then you can move on to try to change the second number in the first row to become a 0. Okay, it just so happened that we didn't have to do that step in both of these examples. But you're just starting with the first row from left to right. Do whatever you need to. Go back to the first number if it gets changed from a 1 like it did in both of our examples. And then get the first row set before you start looking at changing stuff in the second row, and move from left to right in the second row as well. So when you're trying to change a number to become a 0, you're going to have something that looks like this. You're going to use another row, multiply that row by something, and then add it to the row that you're working on. If you're trying to change a number into a 1, all you have to do is multiply that row by whatever it's going to take to make that become a 1.